Today our guest is Dr. Ann Bradley, who's a professor at the Institute of World Politics and Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Fund for American Studies. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Oh, happy to have you here. Now, you are the co-author of a new monograph entitled The Political Economy of Terrorism, Counterterrorism, and the War on Terror. So, what inspired you to work on this topic? I mean, we know that terrorism is back. It seemed like terrorism was gone, right? It was all going to be pure competition, but now, after Gaza in particular, terrorism is back. So, what inspired you to write this?
Well, this is 20 years in the making, I have to say, or 23 years in the making. So I originally became inspired by this topic as a graduate student. And there's, a great story there, I think, which is that my research professor, who ended up being the chair of my dissertation, I was working for him when 9/11 happened. And actually, the morning of 9/11, I had a class at the Fairfax campus of George Mason. And I always like to remind my students of how old I am compared to them, because back in those days, we didn't have smartphones, right? We didn't have kind of this instant access to information. So I was getting ready to go to this 9:30 class early in the morning, and I never turned on a radio. I just got ready. I had no idea what was, or television. I had no idea what was happening. And I got in my car and I turned on the radio, which we almost don't do anymore either, right? Because we're listening to podcasts or streaming music. And I heard kind of, the beginnings of this, and I just turned my car around. And, of course, the world stopped for many of us on that day, those of us who are old enough to remember. And I just remember watching TV all day long, and I think along with other Americans wondering, what is happening? And is this a single event? Is there going to be more tomorrow? Flights were grounded. Everything kind of shut down for a while. And so my professor said, look, economists need to have a voice in this issue. He said there's going to be a mountain of policy that floods out of Congress after this. And some of it will not be well thought out because it will be hurried. And he thought that was a mistake. And so he said, would you like to co-author a paper with me on the topic of terrorism? I said, sure, but I had never thought about writing. I didn't know about terrorism. I didn't know anything about it. And so we wrote kind of a very high-level paper, kind of bringing economic thinking into the topic of terrorism. And after that, I said, I am inspired to do more. And so I ended up writing my dissertation on the political economy of al-Qaeda. And so it's been a research interest of mine for many years. And this book is kind of a culmination of that, with two other co-authors, both who received their PhDs as well from George Mason, who write in this space and on these issues. And we thought, like you said, terrorism is back. Mm-hmm. Maybe we thought it was going away. Maybe it wasn't as prominent in the IC or in the political discourse, but it seems to be back, certainly with a vengeance right now. And I still think new research is warranted because we haven't really solved the problem, and we need to.
Right. Yeah, it never goes away.
Right.
And will never go away.
Correct.
It's sad that in this town, in particular, people glom onto one thing and then onto another thing.
Yes.
Without fixing the first thing.
Agreed. And I think we kind of go with the political headwinds. And so, one thing takes over another. But one of the primary assumptions we make, both in this book and an assumption I made when I started writing this, is that you're never going to get terrorism to be zero. And it has never been zero. As long as we have humans, we have violence and terrorism, but we can mitigate it. And I think it just takes the right mix of policies. And so, again, I think economists can add to that discussion.
And you have a professional background in this as well.
I do. So after I completed my dissertation, my same professor, I went to graduate school to be an academic. I wanted to be in the classroom, and of course I love to be in the classroom, but he said, you should go work for the CIA. And I said, why would I do that? I said, I'm here to get this PhD because I want to be in the classroom. I love teaching. And he said, well, you've developed a theory, an economic theory that can perhaps help what people on the ground are doing. And he said, so, I think it would be very useful for you to kind of take that theory to the streets, so to speak. So that's what I did. So I worked in counterterrorism at the CIA for a little bit of time.
Fantastic. Well, let's get into it then. Talk about how economic conditions contribute to the rise and perpetuation of terrorism.
Absolutely. So I will answer that. I want to start one step before that, which is to say that one of the first things we do as economists is kind of we draw that supply and demand curve, right? And that makes a lot of sense to us when we're talking about buying a cup of coffee, right? Buying a new house and everything in between those things. It's not as intuitive for people to think that there's an upward sloping supply curve of terrorism that does respond to conditions of price and cost. And then there's a downward sloping demand for terrorism, and that's actually really important. And so, why does terrorism emerge? To answer that question and then to ultimately solve the problem of terrorism, or not solve, right? We're never going to get zero, but to mitigate terrorism, I think we must focus on that demand curve. And so one of the kind of ironclad laws of economics is that supply is always a response to demand. So if you want to stop the supply of something, you have to figure out why people are doing it in the first place. And so one of the things that we point out in our research is that it's not that you'll never get terrorism, right, in a country that respects human rights and civil liberties and has robust free markets and political democracy, but the incentives to become a terrorist are much lower in those societies. And so societies that are riddled with all these other types of problems, whether it's theocratic authoritarianism, tribal warfare, civil war, violence, all those types of things, are much more prone to see the emergence of terrorist groups because of what terrorists are trying to do, which is they're trying to change either social, economic, or political conditions.
Right. So how do you mitigate that? I mean, if we have, people talk about root causes, and this is a big discussion in the terrorist space. That's also my background in regular warfare and counterterrorism. So people talk about mitigating root causes, and yet you see a lot of terrorism happening in countries that are the free countries, the democratic countries, the places where you think, what's the problem? Just engage in politics. Why are you turning to political violence? So how do you do that?
So I think part of that answer is, and in my own, thinking on this for 20 years, it's interesting that you say that because you could point to episodes of terrorism in Western Europe, which have historically, this is the home of the Industrial Revolution, in the United States and in other places that we would classify as very free and very open, generally, societies. But I think what you're seeing in those societies, especially in the United States, is 100 years of just massive growth in government. Why is that a problem? I think it's a problem because as the government gets bigger, the stakes for winning in politics and winning in policy become bigger as well. And so people tend to be more upset about outcomes that they disagree with. Whereas if the government was smaller, it had smaller scope and a smaller spending capacity, then again, the fights become different. And I think this is what you see just completely amplified in a country like Afghanistan, which of course, as we know, there's no national identity, there's no kind of unifying identity for people, and so all the squabbles become really intensified because it's a fight not just for a voice, but for political power, religious power, setting the rules of the game. And so I think part of our problem is to bring back, kind of reduce the role of government in people's everyday lives. In the United States, we certainly know that we have a fiscal spending problem, so we have to do this. But I think it's not just a matter of our finances, it's a matter of the incivility that is bred when government kind of takes over civil society in all aspects of our lives. And so I think that's a really big problem. Now, how do you solve it? This is hard because we've been talking about this in Washington for at least 2 decades, right? But if you go back to Reagan and his presidency, he saw that the government was kind of it should be necessarily small. And since the Reagan era, of course, government has just continued to grow. So I think we talk a lot in Washington that we know it's a problem, at least nominally we agree to that, but we don't really solve that problem.
The problem of big government.
Yes. Right. Yes. And I think it's a bipartisan problem for certain.
Oh, sure. Well, it's hard to ask government to solve the problem of big government.
Right. It's like the fox guarding the hen house, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you identify in your monograph the most effective strategies for counterterrorism. How other than shrinking government?
Yes, certainly
which,
one.
It's a long-term project.
Yes.
But for more immediate counterterrorism strategies, what would you recommend?
So we talk about, and again, our book is an attempt to bring a theoretical framework to the real world. So what is that theoretical framework? There's a couple of ways that you can think about categorizing different activities that the United States government could, and the military and the intelligence community could engage in that would mitigate, again, that demand for terrorism. Because I think the ultimate question for me is still, why do people wake up in the morning and say, the best way to get what I want in society is to join a terrorist group where we're just going to kill people and blow things up, and it's very destructive. So one of those things is we can do what's called changing the income effect, right? So that's what I did in terror finance. We were actually trying to limit access to financial resources that terrorists had, because if you reduce their income, at least in the short term, you're going to reduce what their abilities to kind of operate as terrorists. So that's one thing we can do. And I would say it's a short term, right? That's not in the long run going to reduce the demand for terrorism, but it is going to raise the costs. And that's sometimes what we have to do. It might be the only thing we can do in the short term. How do we raise the costs for them to do what they want to do? The other thing we can do is just try to, and this is economics language, is change their opportunity costs, right? And I think that's actually much more difficult. So how do you help societies like Afghanistan, which seems to be a place where terrorists thrive and operate? How do you raise the opportunity cost for terrorists in societies like that? Well, that fundamentally requires that the societies change, right? That's not an easy thing. And not only is that not easy, but it's not something the United States can do, right? We can't kind of wave a policy wand or engage in a military strategy and say, now Afghanistan, you're on the path to freedom and wealth and enjoy your riches, right? So those changes are necessarily internal, and that's really a challenge. And so that's why I think looking at development economics and things like this could perhaps help us learn some lessons about how poor countries have become rich. So I think that's another thing that we can do. And then there's another kind of thinking, the third category, which is the substitution effect. And so, if terrorists are engaging in terrorism for the point, broadly speaking, of social change, is there a way to think about affecting their opportunities such that terrorism becomes a less attractive option for them to get what they want? What does that look like? So when we look at the new conflict, well, it's not new, but the recent events between Israel and Hamas, right? I mean, this seems to be a place where we could bring that thinking to bear, right? The United States, I don't think, can solve this problem externally. That doesn't mean we're powerless to do anything, but I think ultimately this is a question of, kind of some sort of game of chicken that's being played, right? And so how do you change the incentives so that the game changes and a peaceful or a more peaceful solution can happen? And so these are really complex problems, and I don't think there's one policy that fits all the problems of terrorism that we look at around the world, but I think these principles can inform those policies to get us on a better path.
Oh, yes. And, since you mentioned Gaza, I mean, that's going to be a great development opportunity for somebody.
Yeah.
A lot of rubble to clear out and a lot of buildings to build.
Yes, a lot of buildings to build, but, the problem with that is that the massive amount of devastation that had to happen for those new buildings to be built, right? We want that suboptimal equilibrium of violence to change over time. And I think the tough questions are, what is the role of the United States in that relationship, and what is our relationship to Israel? What is our relationship to Palestine? And then, what role do we have? And I don't have all the answers, but I think we have to think in a really principled way about how to get there.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, the real development, as you say, it's not the buildings per se, but the people.
Yes, absolutely. Right? So there's people on the ground, and if you think about people that live in Palestine, these are not people that are living, kind of the American dream, right? I mean, they are oppressed by the regime that rules over them. And this is, in many cases, true in the places in the world that are the worst for terrorism. So those things are very connected, right? The kind of the path to democracy, the path to economic development is part of what will loosen the shackles of the people that are mired in that oppression. And so I think we have to always put a human face on this. And remember, I love that what you just said. It's about the people that live in those countries, and we have to kind of, if we forget their humanity, then I don't think we'll be as careful in our strategy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The human infrastructure. And surely we've learned lessons about that over the past 20, 30 years.
Yes, many opportunities to learn that. One of the things I just did a little research, Professor Harmon at IWP and I were on a panel talking about this recently, and I like to kind of speak in, data points because I'm an economist, I guess. And so I looked at the total spending on the war on terror starting right after 9/11 and going to today. So there's a great project at Brown University called the Costs of War Project. And there's just many white papers, lots of people that are from not just academics, but practitioners who really are invested in this line of research. And what they estimate, this is the full cost of the war on terror from the United States perspective, is about $8 trillion. That's a lot of money, right? So
from 2001.
From 2001 to today. So I thought, okay, well, how big is that number, right? And so I thought, if the war on terror was a country, how would it rank in overall GDP? And it would be the third biggest country in the world. It's the United States, China, the war on terror, and then Germany. So the point, why do I bring it up like that? I think the point is this: we've spent a massive amount of financial resources, but also we've dedicated our military. We've lost lives on both sides. And so, but if you look at Afghanistan, we haven't made a lot of progress.
That's an understatement.
Of the year, perhaps, right? And so what The Economist says here is, okay, this doesn't mean we do nothing. It doesn't mean we pack up our bags and go home and say, forget about it. We gave it the good college try. No, we just say, what are the alternative ways that we can use to get better outcomes at a lower cost? And so I think when you invite an economist into this conversation, that other people get worried, right? Because we criticize, because we're just doing cost-benefit analysis, so we might be critical of the current way of doing things. But that, again, doesn't mean don't do anything. It means let's be clever and creative and really think about incentives so that we can spend less and get more.
Yeah,
I think that's the goal.
Absolutely. I'm a regular reader of the reports from SIGAR out of Afghanistan and all the wasted money, just incredible over that 20-odd year period. But it's interesting that you mentioned cost factors because, of course, the terrorists also think this way.
They very much do.
When you look at Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others, they openly talk about the fact that they can do a low-cost terrorist effort that then we respond with multi-million-dollar missiles and
Right.
Other things like that, aircraft and these huge operations that cost us a lot, and they consider that a win in the grand attrition war that they're fighting. Like, they do a low-cost,
Yes.
low-expense terrorist thing, and suddenly we're spending billions of dollars to counter the one thing that they did, and they think that's great.
Well, I think it in a weird way, this is them winning on the margin, right? Because it says we got the attention of the United States government, the most powerful government in the world, the government that lots of other people listen to, right? And the best and most well-financed military in the world. So it's exactly what you said. They spent $500,000, which, by the way, if you look at the 9/11 Commission report, the estimate is that 9/11 cost about $500,000. And so when I say that to people, it is an astounding fact, right? And then we respond with $8 trillion over 23 years. Well, Al-Qaeda wants us to do that because the point of terrorism is to terrorize people. And what this also leads to in an economic sense is trade diversion and inefficient resource allocation. Should we be spending $8 trillion? Probably not, right? I think that's easy to say. And maybe it's harder to come up with what the right number is. But I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think it's on their behalf, it's viewed as a victory. Because if you look at what the terrorists say, I mean, especially bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, which is what I started studying, I mean, he loved to talk. So the beauty of that is that you knew a lot about what he was saying. Now, some of it was rhetorical and hyperbolic, but some of it was just, look, this is what I hate. And so if you want to take down capitalism and take down the U.S. government, one way to do that is to get them to waste a lot of money for 2 decades. Right? I mean, exactly.
Yeah, and of course he had a background in business administration.
Absolutely, no dummy.
So he knew what he was talking about.
Yes.
Let's talk about globalization.
Yes.
And the impact of globalization on these strategies, because globalization, and people may or may not know, it is also one of the causes of terrorism, because the terrorists in their writings, particularly the Middle Eastern, Islamic fundamentalist groups, talk about how bad it is that all this Western-oriented stuff is coming in. All these really heinous things like women's rights and equality and free trade and free thinking and all these really terrible things that they hate are coming in. So for them, it's kind of this reaction to globalism. I mean, how has that, from an economic perspective, affected things?
That's a great question, and I think it's a big question in the sense that, economists disagree about many things. But I think one thing they kind of almost universally agree on is where you can get it, free trade and more open trade is better than more constrained trade, because it brings people together and it allows us to grow wealth. So, all in, economists, I think, generally think, look, this global trade that we have, and that really has been developing since the Industrial Revolution, but globalization is much newer than that. I think they view it as a good thing, right? It's we have more customers in the world, and we have more ability to buy things from the rest of the world, and that commerce is pacifying. Do commerce, right? So that commerce brings people together. But of course, if you hate Western civilization as a matter of fact, then you hate this, right? Because I actually think what commerce does for ordinary people, we were talking about people earlier, what access to global markets would do for the people of Palestine is exactly what their oppressors don't want them to have access to. You mentioned things like women's rights, minority rights, equality before the law, the rule of law itself. I mean, these are things that are just integral to Western civilization and human freedom, and they're antithetical to what authoritarian regimes want and what terrorists need. And so I think that this is the real problem, and this is why the railing against globalization, right? It maybe amps up the terrorists, because it certainly allowed bin Laden. Here's an example. And I think part of this is economic, and I think part of it is political. And so let me explain that. What we saw with energy, for example, so petroleum, in the post-World War II era, there was just a skyrocketing demand for electricity, for energy, right? As people, there's two things that drive the demand for energy: population growth and economic growth. And we had both of those in the post-World War II era. And so that meant that, unfortunately, I think, over the second half of the 20th century, oil became a very politicized good, right? So OPEC was an international cartel, for example. And so that certainly created resentment, because for bin Laden himself, he viewed the United States as meddling in Saudi Arabian politics and governance because of oil. And so he kind of ultimately blames capitalism for that. So I think you have those political factors, but I also agree that you have the economic factors. One more thing I want to say on this, because I could talk about this question all day, but my colleague Don Boudreau at George Mason has written a very short article that anyone can access online. It's called Globalization, More Than Just Stuff. And it's a great piece because he kind of argues exactly what you're saying, that globalization is not just about the fact that I can go to Harris Teeter tomorrow morning and buy 5 bananas for $1.35, which is amazing because we don't even grow bananas in the United States, because we don't have the environment to do it cheaply. It's not just about the stuff. It's actually about this, the commercial progress that allows us to share the values of Western civilization. And when the people on the ground in Afghanistan say, hey, I could have freedom, I could have a government that respects my dignity, the authoritarians hate that, right? And so I think that is, you're absolutely right to say that it's for the terrorists, they want to kind of make sure that doesn't happen. They want to close their borders to trade because they know, again, it's not just about the stuff, it's about the values.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at Gaza, there's no problem in Gaza that couldn't be solved with a huge dose of globalization.
Yep.
Would help them a lot. Stop building terrorist subways.
Yes.
And start investing in banking or something.
And grocery stores.
Yeah, property rights.
Exactly.
Dr. Lanchowski, our chancellor and founder at IWP, he likes to talk about studies in Egypt showing how the fact that they don't have a really good property law system in Egypt, I mean, it's kind of up in the air all the time, and so that prevents investment, it prevents growth. People don't know what to do because they don't know what they own. And ownership
Exactly.
is such a key factor of this in making this identity that we're talking about that grew up in the West, you know, the individual with their property and their liberties and the rule of law.
Absolutely.
And when you're lacking that, when everything is, you know, controlled by an authoritarian terrorist group that wants to take the billions of dollars of aid that are pouring into you from the altruistic international community to build terrorist subways instead of something else, then you don't get that development.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, it's really important that you brought up humanitarian aid because, of course, we've been writing about economic growth as economists for, you know, over 100 years, and maybe we're still not that great at understanding it, I think. But I think one of the big pitfalls in humanitarian aid is exactly what you said, is that it has created a culture of dependency from country to country. I think the United States certainly uses that to their advantage strategically, but I think the problem is that in many cases, the governments capture the aid. And so what are we ultimately doing there? We're like funding regimes that we say that we hate. And we
Right.
don't want to do that. It might be an unintended consequence, but that probably means we need to reform aid. And so I think your point about property rights is so important because we've never ever seen a country develop from poor to wealthy just based on redistribution. Right? It's easy to take
right.
money from rich countries and give it to poor countries. It's easy to take, you know, we have a lot of clean water here. So we can move that clean water to somewhere, you know, in the African continent, and that might be a good thing to do, but that alone does not stimulate economic growth. And economic growth is what they need to kind of fully escape the terrorist kind of, you know, environment that they live in and the authoritarian environment. And so how do they get that development of property rights, which necessitates the rule of law, which necessitates a legitimate government? So, you know, it's hard because all those things are work together. But I think if you look at the past 250 years of economic history, what you see is that prior to that, all countries were poor, relatively speaking, and the people in those countries, you know, lived short lives. They didn't have high standards of living. And so the good news is there's not this vicious cycle of poverty that people can never escape. And so one thing I talk to my students about all the time is that we have to understand the philosophy of the Western tradition and the necessity of human dignity, private property, legitimate government, all those things. And then we have to understand how economies work. And when we can understand those two things, what we see is that there is no such thing as economic destiny. Just because Afghanistan, Cuba, Haiti, you know, North Korea are mired in poverty and oppression today absolutely does not necessarily indicate they will always be like that. That change in institutions is possible, but it requires some really important things. And so with Cuba, you know, they haven't been able to do that. Haiti, they haven't been able to do that. Haiti is the NGO capital of the world. There's more NGOs in Haiti than anywhere else per capita, and they remain poor. So it's not about just humanitarian aid, right? I think sometimes those types of gifts, while, as you say, well-intended, have some pretty undesirable, unintended consequences. So we just need to be smarter about the way we do that.
Oh, absolutely. I want to talk about technology a little bit.
Okay.
If you look over the past, I don't know, 50 years, 30 years, 20 years, I mean, the technology of finance has changed dramatically and, you know, has touched everything. But also has touched terrorism. I mean, in the past, they'd transfer wealth with bags of diamonds, or, you know, something like that. And now maybe they use cryptocurrency or,
Yes.
you know, these types of things. So how does that affect an economic approach to counterterrorism?
That's a great question. And of course, you know, in my time at the agency, we were, you know, that was 20 years ago, so it was a lot less sophisticated than it is now. So we weren't really dealing with crypto or what that looked like back then, but they certainly are today. And I think, you know, you're right. I think we're going to have to, the problem with fighting terrorism and the problem in general, and there's other people at IWP who can talk with much more authority on this than myself, but you don't know what you don't know, which is kind of a redundant saying, but it's really true when you're doing intelligence, right? You're always one step behind the terrorists. You're always actually trying to figure out what they've already done and the technologies that they're using, and they're good at encrypting those technologies just like everybody else, right? So the technology that's available to us that allows us to get paid by our institution and have it go right into our bank account is the technology that's available to them. So I'm wary of the argument that we need to just kind of over-regulate technology or make sure it doesn't get in the right hands, because I just actually don't think there's a way to do that. I think, the technology is already out there. It's just a matter of the terrorists adopting it. What we do need to, again, this is where the kind of supply and demand curve thinking comes in. I think in the short term, we have to try to intercept what they're doing, which means we need a lot of intelligence work that's very, thoughtful and able to kind of understand what's going on. But then I think we need the long-term approach as well. So I think terrorists are going to be more clever in this new world, but we're more clever too, because we not understand how the technologies work. It's interesting, though, when you mention things like cryptocurrency. When economists look at the underdeveloped world, the poorest countries that remain, the biggest adopters of digital currency and cryptocurrency are people that want to make transactions, but their countries are so poor and their governments are so broken that they have no banking infrastructure. Right. So these are the first adopters, and they want to use it because they want to engage in trade. So, and the terrorists are doing that too. I think the other thing about terror finance is that terrorists are absolutely not stupid. I mean, we know that, right? But
right.
Sometimes when you talk to people, their impression of the terrorist is like a highly irrational person that doesn't respond to cost-benefit analysis. And my entire 20-year research project is based on the opposite of that, right? Terrorists are very clever. They know what they want, and they work really hard to maximize their benefit and minimize their cost, just like everybody else. And so I think we're going to have to realize that they're going to be savvy, they're going to adapt new technologies, and they have very diversified portfolios. So some terrorist organizations, of course, trade and transact in legitimate goods and services, along with maybe heroin or illegal drugs. And they use cash, but they also use digital currency, and they may still use bags of diamonds, as you said,
yes.
right? So they're very clever. And so we can't have a one-pronged approach to intercept their financial transactions. We have to have a multi-pronged approach.
Oh, definitely. And great point. I mean, the terrorist leaders especially, many of them are well-educated, many of them, highly Western, highly cultured. They're not just some guy in a cave,
Absolutely.
They're coming from a place of intelligence, so they're not going to make stupid mistakes, although sometimes they do. So we have to kind of wrap up, but what are your policy recommendations? I mean, how do we go from here? What's the future going to look like in terms of the economic aspect of counterterrorism?
So I think that the overall patterns of terrorism right now, when I look at the past 20 years, are not necessarily very encouraging. So we have terrorism in Nigeria, for example, that was kind of like a non-problem prior to 2000. And so while the United States has not had a transnational terrorist attack like we did on 9/11 again, which is a good thing, terrorism has kind of spread. And al-Qaeda itself has become very decentralized. So it's an entirely different organization than it was when it started in the late 80s. And so I think that is a hard problem for the intelligence community and for counterterrorism efforts, because you're not just chasing al-Qaeda, which used to be the three leaders and their band of brothers or something. Now al-Qaeda might be 20 organizations now. And so what does that look like, and how do we fight it, I think is a really tough question. So what I would say is, I think we need to, again, go back to thinking about the long game and the short game. My critique of U.S. counterterrorism policy is generally that we are overly focused on the short game, and I understand why. Right after 9/11, you remember George Bush in the hard hat with the flag behind him at Ground Zero, and he gives this very powerful speech about how we are not going to stop, not only till al-Qaeda is wiped off the planet, but every terrorist group. Well, we already talked about the fact that we really can't do that, but I think that we have to be smart about what does it take to get less. And it can't just be focusing on obliterating the enemy. We might have to do that sometimes, right? If we find a terrorist cell and we can do something about it, and we can, kill them or lock them up or detain them, great. But, what I don't want us to play, I use the analogy if you've ever been to an arcade with your kids, right? You play whack-a-mole, right? So it's like this big mallet, and you whack the mole, and the mole comes back up in a different spot. And I think the past 20 years, we've been playing whack-a-mole, and I want to play less whack-a-mole because I want the moles to go away because they found something else to do with their time. So I think that, again, takes us back to how do we think about advancing economic freedom? I think we need to pursue the short-term tactical and strategic counterterrorism policies, which includes intercepting finances. It includes breaking up cells and intercepting plots, but I think that's just the short game. The long game is, how do we advance the ideas of a free and democratic society across the world, but in the places where terrorists have havens today? And I think we need to do more of that. We've done a lot of the first, so I think we could change some of those strategies to be more effective, but I think we need a lot more of the second. And this is what the United States is great at.
Right.
This is why people immigrate here.
Yes.
Why do people come across the border? Because it's a great place to live. Right? It's still the beacon of freedom if we can keep it that way. So we have problems, but the world looks to us and says, this is, I would like to be an American.
Right.
Right? The average
Yes.
Palestinian, if they could see how you and I live on a daily basis, that's pretty great.
Yes.
So we need to bring that to their home countries. How do we do that? And I think that those are real questions we need to pursue from a policy and a strategic perspective.
Oh, absolutely. With Gaza, it's a fantastic test case. People always talk like the day after or, whatever, phase 4, whatever it's going to be. Gaza is a great test case. Are we going to go back to the, handouts and graft and all the things that got them where they are right now? Or are we going to go to more of a pro-capitalism, pro-liberty development model
Yes.
that focuses on freeing the Palestinian people from Hamas, from the PA, from their hate, into a more Western-style, American-style, pro-liberty type of development model?
Yep, I couldn't agree more.
We will see, right?
Yeah, that's right. We'll see.
They should put you in charge of it.
Oh, well, you can. I don't know. If you're in charge of putting me in charge, then I accept.
Okay, yeah, we'll make some phone calls.
Okay,
right?
good.
Okay. Well, thanks, Anne, for joining us on the IWP podcast. It's been a great conversation. Love to have you back sometime.
I would love to come back. Thanks for having me.